Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange world of weird medieval rules. The kind of laws that sound ridiculous today, but in the context of castles, plagues, and chronic bad hygiene actually made sense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Every night, in nearly every town across medieval Europe, a bell rang out over the rooftops. And when it did, thousands of people stopped whatever they were doing and walked to their hearths to bury the fire in ash. Not because anyone told a good story about it. Not because it was tradition for tradition's sake. They did it because the alternative was watching everything. They own turn to smoke before sunrise. Picture a town somewhere in 12th century France. Narrow streets, barely wide enough for two carts to pass. Houses built shoulder to shoulder, their upper floors leaning out over the road until the buildings on either side nearly touched at the top, blotting out the sky. And almost every single one of those houses is made, at least in part, of timber. Timber frames, timber floors, thatched or wood-shingled roofs, straw scattered across dirt floors for warmth. Wattle and daub walls, woven branches packed with mud and dried grass that might hold a room together, but burn like kindling the moment a spark catches them. Now picture a single household hearth, still glowing at midnight, in a house like that. A gust of wind through a gap in the wall, an ember lifting off a dying log. It lands in straw. It smolders. Nobody notices for 20 minutes, because everyone in the house is asleep. That is how you lose a town. This wasn't a hypothetical fear. It was a lived, repeated, catastrophic reality. Fire was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest killers of the urban Middle Ages, not because flames themselves were so lethal, but because of how fast they spread through cities built the way medieval cities were built. A fire that started in one baker's oven at 2 in the morning could, by dawn, have consumed an entire quarter of a city. Streets so narrow that flames could leap from one leaning rooftop to the one across the street without ever touching the ground. No fire brigades, no hoses, no water pressure, just buckets, hand chains, and desperate men tearing down neighboring buildings with hooks and axes, trying to create a gap the fire couldn't cross. London burned this way more than once before the more famous fire of 1666 that people tend to remember. Rouen burned. Many other cities burned so often across the centuries that chroniclers sometimes struggled to keep the different fires straight in their records, this year's disaster blending into the memory of the last one. So towns did something that sounds almost absurdly simple, but was in fact one of the earliest and most effective pieces of civic fire regulation in European history. They set a curfew. Not a curfew in the modern sense of stay indoors after dark for safety from crime, though that mattered too. The original meaning was far more literal. The French term was couvre-feu, cover fire, at a set hour, usually marked by the ringing of a bell from a church tower or a town hall. Every household was required to smother, bank, or cover their hearth fire. Ashes raked over the embers, cooking fires extinguished, candles put out wherever possible. The town, as much as it could manage, was to go dark and cold for the night. This law shows up again and again across medieval Europe, in slightly different forms, in city after city. In England, the practice is often associated, somewhat unfairly, with William the Conqueror, who is sometimes credited, or blamed, with formalizing a curfew bell after the Norman conquest. Whether or not he invented it outright, the practice of a fire curfew was already widespread across the continent, arising independently in town after town because every town shared the same terrifying vulnerability. Wood, straw, wind, fire. It didn't take a king's decree for people to understand the danger. It took one bad night. What's fascinating, and this is where the weird rule for a good reason really earns its place, is how seriously towns enforce this. Being caught with an uncovered fire after the curfew bell wasn't treated as some minor inconvenience. In many towns it carried a fine. Repeated violations could bring harsher penalties. Night watchmen were tasked, among their other duties, with patrolling the streets, specifically listening and looking for the telltale orange glow of a fire that hadn't been properly banked. A watchman spotting light flickering under a shuttered window at an hour when there shouldn't have been any open flame at all was not being nosy. He was doing the one job that stood between the town and possible annihilation. Think about what this actually asked of ordinary people, night after night, for generations. No fire to see by. No fire to keep a room warm on the coldest nights of the year, precisely when you'd want one most. No easy way to reheat food, to finish a task by lamplight, to comfort a child afraid of the dark. The curfew bell was, in effect, asking an entire population to accept discomfort, real, physical discomfort, in exchange for collective safety. And by and large, they did it, because the math was brutally clear. A cold night was survivable. A burned house, or a burned street, or a burned town, sometimes was not. There's something communal about this rule that's easy to miss at first. Fire doesn't respect property lines. One household's carelessness could destroy a neighbor's home, a neighbor's business, a neighbor's family, without that neighbor ever having done anything wrong. In a world without insurance, without a fire department, without any mechanism to make a burned-out family whole again, the curfew bell functioned as a kind of primitive social contract. Everyone gave something up, a little warmth, a little light, a little convenience, so that no single person's negligence could become everyone's catastrophe. It's also worth noting how the rule adapted as cities changed. As chimneys became more common, replacing the older, more dangerous practice of an open central hearth vented through a hole in the roof, some of the most acute fire risks did ease somewhat. Enclosed hearths and proper flues meant embers were less likely to escape directly into a room full of straw and timber. But the curfew tradition persisted in many places regardless, sometimes shifting in purpose. The bell that once meant, smother your fire or face a fine, gradually became, in some towns, simply the signal that marked the boundary between the working day and the night. The moment gates closed, watchmen took up their rounds, and the streets emptied of anyone without good reason to be out. That shift matters, because it shows how a rule born purely out of terror of fire slowly folded into a broader set of anxieties about what happens in a town after dark, anxieties about theft, about drunkenness, about strangers moving through streets nobody could properly see. We'll come back to that side of the curfew bell later, in a different chapter, when we look at what medieval towns did to keep the peace once the fires were out and the streets went quiet. But it started here. It started with wood and straw and wind, and a very simple, very brutal truth. In a town built the way medieval towns were built, one careless fire could erase what 100 families had spent their whole lives building. The bell wasn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It was the sound of a community trying, imperfectly, to protect itself from itself. And it worked, more often than it failed, which is precisely why history remembers the fires that got through anyway. The famous ones. The catastrophic ones. Because most nights, in most towns, the bell rang, the hearths went dark, and nothing happened at all. No flames. No panic. No smoke against the stars. Just an ordinary, uneventful night, which was, in a world this flammable, the entire point. If you ever wondered why so many old European towns still have a bell tower standing at the center of things, older than the church that grew up around it, older than the town hall beside it, now you know one of the quieter reasons it might be there. Not to call people to worship, not to mark the hour for its own sake, but once, long ago, to remind an entire town, all at once, every single night. Put out your fire, or lose everything. Imagine being fined, an actual, legally enforceable fine, for the crime of wearing the wrong color coat to market. It sounds like something out of a fever dream of bureaucracy. And yet across medieval and early modern Europe, laws regulating exactly this existed in astonishing detail for centuries, in country after country. They were called sumptuary laws, and while historians often frame them as being about controlling extravagance and preserving social hierarchy, which is true, there's a second, less discussed layer to these laws that had almost nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with economics, chemistry, and the simple fragility of a medieval town's supply chains. Let's start with what these laws actually said, because the specificity is almost hard to believe. In various times and places, laws dictated which social classes were permitted to wear certain furs. Ermine, for instance, was often reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, with lesser nobles and merchants explicitly barred from wearing it regardless of how much money they had. Laws dictated the length of a man's shoes, the width of a woman's sleeves, the number of buttons permitted on a coat depending on rank. And color was regulated with extraordinary precision. Certain shades of purple, certain deep and saturated reds, certain golds, were reserved by law for the aristocracy or the very wealthy merchant class, and forbidden to everyone below them, no matter how much coin they had to spend. On the surface, this looks like pure snobbery encoded into law, and a great deal of it absolutely was. A visible hierarchy mattered enormously to medieval and early modern elites. If a wealthy wool merchant could dress exactly like a duke, then how would anyone on the street know, at a glance, who held real power and who didn't? In a society that depended heavily on visible signals of rank, for everything from who got the best seat at a feast to who a stranger owed deference to when passing on the road, clothing was doing a huge amount of communicative work. Blurring that signal, in the eyes of the ruling class, felt like blurring the entire social order itself. But there's a second story hiding underneath the snobbery, and it has to do with what these colors actually cost to produce, and what producing them could do to a town. Take purple. The most famous and most tightly restricted purple dye in the ancient and early medieval world was Tyrian purple, extracted, almost unbelievably, from the mucus glands of a particular species of sea snail. It took an enormous number of snails, thousands upon thousands, to produce even a small quantity of usable dye. The process was slow, foul-smelling, and expensive at every stage. A garment dyed a true, deep purple wasn't just beautiful. It represented an almost unimaginable amount of specialized labor and rare raw material. Restricting who could wear it wasn't only about hierarchy. It was, in a very real sense, restricting who could plausibly afford to divert that much specialized production toward personal vanity, in economies where labor and resources were desperately needed elsewhere. Reds tell a similar story. Some of the richest, most vivid red dyes in the medieval world came from specific insects, most notably a scale insect that, when crushed and processed correctly, produced a brilliant crimson. Producing enough dye for even modest quantities of cloth required harvesting staggering numbers of these tiny insects. The dye was, quite literally, worth its weight in silver in certain periods and places. A merchant showing up in head-to-toe crimson wasn't simply flaunting wealth in the abstract. He was visibly burning through a resource so labor-intensive that entire cottage industries existed just to supply it in small, controlled quantities. Now bring in the more practical, less symbolic side of the story. Dyeing itself was often a really hazardous trade, and unregulated dyeing could pose real dangers to a town. Many dye processes required mordants, chemical fixatives that helped color bind permanently to fabric, and some of the most effective mordants involved substances that were, by any modern standard, toxic. Certain dye baths gave off foul, occasionally dangerous fumes. Dye works needed huge quantities of water, and that water, once used, came out the other end contaminated with chemical residue, dumped back into rivers and streams that towns downstream depended on for drinking water, washing, and cooking. An unregulated boom in demand for a particular fashionable color could mean an unregulated boom in dye production, which could mean contaminated water, overtaxed local resources, and genuine public health consequences for an entire town, not just the people wearing the finished cloth. So when a town or a kingdom passed a sumptuary law restricting certain colors to certain classes, it wasn't only enforcing snobbery for its own sake, though it absolutely was doing that too. It was also, whether explicitly acknowledged or not, throttling demand for some of the most resource-intensive, most polluting, most economically disruptive luxury goods a medieval economy could produce. Keep the number of people legally permitted to wear true purple or deep crimson small enough, and you keep the number of dye vats bubbling away on the edge of town small enough too. Fewer dye vats meant less contaminated runoff, fewer toxic fumes drifting over a crowded neighborhood, and less pressure on an already fragile local supply of clean water. There's also a labor and food security angle that's easy to miss. Every hour a skilled dyer, weaver, or embroiderer spent producing an elaborate, forbidden to most garment for one wealthy client was an hour not spent producing plainer, more affordable cloth that ordinary people actually needed to survive a winter. In economies that were, more often than not, one bad harvest away from real hardship, some authorities worried about skilled labor and scarce dye materials being diverted en masse toward pure extravagance for the very top of society. Restricting who could legally purchase and where certain fabrics and colors was, in a roundabout way, an attempt to protect the broader economy's capacity to clothe everyone, not just the richest few. None of this means sumptuary laws were fair, or even particularly effective. They were famously, notoriously difficult to enforce, and wealthy merchants routinely paid fines as a simple cost of doing business, treating the penalty as a kind of luxury tax rather than an actual deterrent. Plenty of historians rightly point out that the primary function of these laws really was about preserving visible class hierarchy, full stop, and that the environmental and economic arguments were secondary at best in the minds of the lawmakers themselves. But when you actually trace a single forbidden color back to its source, back to the snail beds, the insect harvests, the toxic mordant vats steaming on the edge of town, you start to see that these strange, granular laws about buttons and sleeve widths and shades of purple weren't only about who got to look important. They were quietly tangled up with questions of water safety, skilled labor allocation, and the finite resources of towns that had very little margin for error. The wrong-colored coat wasn't just a fashion violation. In its own strange, indirect way, it was an environmental and economic one too. Let's begin again, properly. On an ordinary day in Paris, sometime in the 12th century, a young prince was riding through the city streets when a pig, a single, ordinary, loose pig, wandering exactly where pigs were never supposed to be, darted directly beneath his horse's legs. The horse startled violently. The prince was thrown, and Philip, the son of King Louis VI of France, died from the injuries of that fall, in the street, because of a pig. This wasn't folklore dressed up for dramatic effect. It's a documented tragedy that rippled through the French court, and it crystallizes, better than almost any other single incident from the period, exactly why medieval cities eventually cracked down hard on the practice of letting livestock roam city streets freely. Because here's the thing modern audiences tend to forget. For a very long time, letting your pig wander the streets of a medieval town wasn't some shocking breach of etiquette. It was just how things worked. Pigs were, in a very practical sense, the original urban sanitation system. They ate garbage. They ate scraps. They ate waste that would otherwise have piled up in the streets, attracting rats, breeding disease, and stinking up an already crowded, already unsanitary environment. Letting your pig roam free during the day, foraging through whatever refuse it could find before coming home in the evening, was a low-effort, low-cost way to both feed your animal and clean your street, all at once. Multiply that by every household in a crowded medieval city that kept a pig, and you get streets absolutely thick with roaming livestock. Not just pigs, but chickens, goats, sometimes even cattle being driven through on their way to slaughter or market. The problem, of course, is that streets full of large, unpredictable animals moving freely among carts, horses, pedestrians, and children were an accident waiting to happen, over and over again, in ways both minor and catastrophic. A startled horse could throw its rider. A charging pig could knock over a market stall, injure a child, or trample someone underfoot. Waste from the animals themselves piled up in the very streets they were meant to help clean, creating a different kind of filth problem entirely. And in a city as dense and as important as medieval Paris, a city that hosted royalty, church officials, foreign dignitaries, and enormous crowds for markets and festivals, the sheer chaos of loose livestock wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was, as the death of a king's own son proved beyond any argument, a genuine and sometimes fatal danger. After Prince Philip's death, the reaction in Paris was significant enough that it's remembered specifically in connection with efforts to restrict pigs from roaming the city streets freely, an early, high-profile example of a broader pattern that played out, with local variations, in towns and cities across medieval Europe as populations grew and streets grew more crowded. Regulations began appearing that restricted where pigs could be kept, required them to be penned or supervised rather than left to wander, and in some cases banned certain animals from city centers entirely, pushing that kind of loose foraging out to the margins of town or requiring it to happen only in specific, controlled areas. This wasn't an isolated French quirk, either. Across medieval Europe, as towns grew denser and more commercially important, you see a recurring pattern of local ordinances tightening the rules around livestock in public streets, sometimes triggered by a specific accident, sometimes simply by the accumulating, unglamorous frustration of merchants whose stalls kept getting knocked over, of pedestrians tired of dodging animal waste, of city officials increasingly worried about the public health implications of streets that functioned, in effect, as open-air farmyards. And the public health angle deserves real attention here, because it's easy to focus only on the dramatic image of a startled horse and miss the slower, quieter danger that loose livestock represented. Animal waste in the streets wasn't just unpleasant to step in. It was a genuine breeding ground for the kind of filth that medieval towns, lacking any real understanding of germ theory, still intuitively understood was connected to sickness. Streets thick with animal waste attracted rats and other vermin in even greater numbers than human refuse alone. Standing water contaminated by animal waste seeped into wells and waterways. In a world already terrified of plague and dysentery and a dozen other diseases, nobody could properly explain anything that visibly, obviously worsened the filth of a crowded street was, over time, going to attract regulation, even without a fully modern understanding of exactly why it mattered. There's also a simple matter of urban function to consider. As towns grew wealthier and more central to trade, their streets had to serve an increasingly complicated set of purposes all at once. Carts hauling goods to market, foot traffic for merchants and shoppers, official processions, religious festivals, and the ordinary daily business of thousands of residents moving through a very confined space. A street actually couldn't serve all of those functions efficiently while also serving as a de facto pig pasture. Something had to give, and as cities grew, it was increasingly the pigs that gave way, pushed into designated areas, pinned on private property, or banned from the most crowded central streets and markets entirely. None of this means livestock vanished from medieval urban life. Far from it. Animals remained a completely normal part of city life for centuries afterward, and enforcement of these early ordinances was often patchy at best, exactly the kind of rule that got ignored by anyone with more urgent priorities than compliance. But the underlying logic, that a growing, increasingly important city could not afford the chaos, filth, and genuine physical danger of fully unregulated livestock in its busiest streets, took hold and spread, city by city, over the following centuries. It's a strange thing to sit with, that one of the more consequential pieces of medieval urban planning, one that quietly reshaped how cities across Europe thought about public space, sanitation, and safety, can be traced back, at least symbolically, to a single startled horse, a single loose pig, and a single fall that cost a king his son. Grand historical shifts are often imagined as the product of sweeping ideas and powerful decrees. Sometimes, though, they start smaller and messier than that. Sometimes they start in the mud of an ordinary street, on an ordinary day, when something went wrong that never should have been possible in the first place, and a city, shaken, finally decided to change how it lived. Walk down a surviving medieval street in a city like York, or in the older quarters of certain towns in Germany and France, and you'll notice something strange the moment you look up. The buildings lean toward each other. Not from age, not from decay. They were built that way, deliberately, floor by floor, each upper story jutting out slightly farther into the street than the floor beneath it, a construction technique called jettying, until in some of the narrowest medieval streets, the upper floors of houses on opposite sides very nearly touched, turning the street below into something closer to a tunnel than an open road. This looks, to modern eyes, almost comically impractical. Why would anyone build a house that got wider the higher it went, encroaching further and further over a public street with every additional floor? The answer turns out to be a mix of clever medieval engineering logic, brutal economic necessity, and, eventually, exactly the kind of civic overcrowding crisis that forced cities to step in and legally limit how far a house could lean. Let's start with why jettying existed at all, because it wasn't random. Medieval towns, especially successful, growing ones, faced a problem that will feel very familiar to anyone living in a modern city. Limited land, high demand, and no easy way to expand outward. Town walls, built for defense, created a hard boundary. Land within those walls was expensive, and a plot at street level was often narrow, sometimes only wide enough for a single room's width of frontage, because property was frequently taxed or valued based on how much ground-level street frontage it occupied. A narrow ground floor, though, didn't have to mean a narrow house. If you extended each upper floor outward, cantilevered over the street on projecting timber beams, you could dramatically increase the usable floor space of the upper stories without paying for, or being taxed on, any additional ground-level footprint at all. It was, in effect, a medieval way of buying more square footage without buying more land, squeezing extra living and working space directly out of the open air above a public street. There were practical construction advantages too. Jettied construction could help protect the timber framing and the walls of the lower floor from rain and weather, since the overhanging upper floor acted a bit like an awning, shielding the floor below. It also allowed builders to use shorter, easier-to-source timber beams for the frame, distributing structural loads in ways that worked well with the building techniques and materials available at the time. For a while, this worked out beautifully, for the individual homeowner, at least. But multiply this pattern across an entire street, an entire crowded quarter of a city, over decades of new construction and renovation, each new floor angling out just a little farther than the one below it. And a very different problem starts to emerge at the level of the city as a whole. The streets began to disappear. Not literally. The ground-level roadway was still there, but functionally, streets in the most densely built quarters of some cities became dim, cramped tunnels, closed and overhead by jettied upper floors leaning toward each other from both sides. Sunlight struggled to reach street level in the narrowest lanes. Air circulation, already poor in a crowded medieval city, grew worse. And, tying directly back to the terror we talked about at the very start of this story, fire risk grew worse too. Buildings leaning close together overhead meant flames could leap the gap between one side of the street and the other far more easily, turning what might have been a contained, single-building fire into a street-wide, then quarter-wide, then city-wide catastrophe. So cities eventually pushed back. Regulations began to appear, again, with real variation from city to city and century to century, that restricted how far a jetty could project over a public street, sometimes measured with remarkable, almost bureaucratic precision. Some towns required official inspection and approval of new jetty construction. Some set explicit maximum overhang distances. Some banned jettying altogether in the narrowest, most fire-vulnerable lanes, or required a minimum amount of open sky to remain visible above the street. Disputes between neighboring property owners over whose jetty encroached too far onto whose light or airspace became common enough to show up repeatedly in civic and legal records, an oddly familiar echo of modern property line disputes, just conducted in the language of timber beams and church court hearings instead of surveyors and zoning boards. What's striking here is how clearly this shows medieval cities behaving less like static, unchanging places frozen in time, and more like living systems constantly renegotiating the balance between individual advantage and collective livability. A single homeowner extending their upper floor a little farther over the street made perfect, rational sense from that homeowner's point of view. More space, more value, no extra land cost. But a city full of homeowners all making that same rational individual choice, unchecked, produced streets that were darker, more dangerous, harder to move through, and far more vulnerable to the spread of fire. The jettying restrictions that followed weren't an attack on cleverness or ambition. They were an early, remarkably practical form of what we'd now call urban planning, an attempt to protect the shared resource of the street itself from being slowly squeezed into uselessness by 1,000 individually reasonable decisions. And it worked well enough, in enough places, that when you walk certain preserved medieval streets today, preserved ones, not modern reconstructions built for atmosphere, the buildings you see leaning dramatically toward one another are very often survivors from before those restrictions took hold, or from towns where enforcement was weaker or arrived later. The streets that feel comfortably open, where you can actually see a strip of sky overhead as you walk, are just as often a quiet monument to a rule that succeeded so completely you'd never think to notice it was there at all. That, in the end, might be the strangest thing about this entire chapter of medieval urban life. The rule that worked left almost no visible trace of itself. We remember the leaning houses because they're dramatic, photogenic, obviously strange to modern eyes. We don't think twice about the open streets, the streets where the sky is visible, the streets where a fire could be stopped before it leapt from one side to the other, because an open street doesn't look like anything unusual at all. It just looks like a street, which was, quietly, exactly the point. For a huge portion of the population across medieval Europe, marrying the person you loved wasn't simply a private decision between two people and their families. In many places, if you were a peasant tied to a lord's manor, you needed that lord's permission first, and sometimes you needed to pay for it. This sounds, on its face, like one of the more oppressive and arbitrary rules of the medieval world, and in a lot of ways, it in real terms was oppressive, a real and often resented constraint on ordinary people's most personal decisions. But underneath the unfairness of it sits a set of economic and social pressures that shaped nearly every aspect of manorial life, and understanding them helps explain why a rule this intrusive managed to persist, largely unchallenged in daily practice, for so long. To understand the marriage restriction, you first have to understand what a peasant actually was, economically, to the lord of a manor. In the classic manorial system that structured so much of rural medieval Europe, a lord held land, and that land was worked, in large part, by peasants, many of whom were unfree, bound to the manor in a status usually described as villeinage or serfdom, though the exact terms and degrees of unfreedom varied enormously by region and period. These peasants owed the lord labor, days spent working the lord's own fields, not just their own, along with various dues, often paid in produce, and a web of customary obligations that could feel, from the peasant's side, almost endless. A peasant, in other words, wasn't simply a private individual to the lord. He or she was, in a very real economic sense, a unit of labor attached to a specific piece of land, and the lord had a direct financial stake in how that labor was deployed, inherited, and, crucially, combined through marriage. Marriage mattered enormously to this system for a few overlapping reasons. First, there was the question of labor mobility. If a peasant woman tied to one manor married a man from a different manor, under a different lord, it could mean her labor, and eventually the labor of any children from that marriage, effectively transferred away from her original lord's estate to benefit someone else's. From the original lord's perspective, that was a real economic loss. A productive worker, and potentially generations of future workers, leaving his manor's labor pool for arrivals. It's not hard to see why lords wanted a say in marriages that crossed manorial boundaries, and often charged a fee, sometimes called merchet in English manorial records, for granting permission. Second, there was the question of land. Peasant households typically held a customary right to work a certain plot of manor land, passed down according to local inheritance customs. Marriage could combine two households' land rights, or transfer rights from one family line to another, or, in cases involving a widow or a female heir, determine who would gain access to a valuable holding of land through the marriage itself. A lord had every incentive to keep close watch over exactly this kind of consolidation, both to protect his own rights over the land in question and to prevent any single peasant family from accumulating enough land and labor to become an unusually powerful, potentially troublesome force within the manor. Third, and this is easy to overlook, there was the sheer practical matter of village stability. A medieval manor functioned, in many ways, as a single interconnected economic organism. Labor had to be available at precisely the right moments for planting, tending, and harvesting. Disruptions to who lived where, and who was available to work which fields, rippled outward in ways that could truly threaten a community's food security for the coming year. A sudden wave of marriages pulling labor away from the manor, or concentrating too much land in too few hands, wasn't an abstract inconvenience to a medieval lord. It was a direct threat to the harvest, and the harvest was the difference between a manageable winter and a really dangerous one. None of this is meant to excuse the rule, or to suggest peasants themselves experienced it as some reasonable, mutually beneficial arrangement rather than a real intrusion into one of the most personal decisions a person can make. Historical records make clear that peasants resented these restrictions, worked around them where they could, and in some documented cases petitioned, resisted, or simply defied their lords when the economic logic of the manor collided too painfully with their own wishes. The fees charged for marriage permission were, in many places, a genuine and resented financial burden layered on top of an already heavy load of manorial dues and obligations. But the rule persisted for so long, across so many different regions and centuries of medieval Europe, precisely because it wasn't arbitrary cruelty for its own sake. It was, from the Lord's perspective, a rational response to a system where a peasant's marriage decision had direct, measurable consequences for the labor supply, land distribution, and overall economic stability of an entire manor. Marriage wasn't just love, or even just family formation. It was, whether anyone framed it this explicitly at the time or not, an economic transaction with consequences that rippled outward across an entire community's ability to feed itself. It's a sobering thing to sit with. The idea that something as intimate as choosing a spouse could become entangled in a lord's ledger of labor and land. But it's also a useful reminder of just how tightly interconnected every part of medieval rural life actually was. Nothing happened in isolation. A single marriage could shift the balance of who worked which field, who inherited which cottage, who owed labor to which lord. And in a world running as close to the margin of survival as most medieval villages did, that kind of ripple effect wasn't something any lord, fairly or not, was willing to leave entirely to chance. Once the curfew bell had rung and the hearth fires had been banked for the night, a medieval town didn't simply go to sleep. It went quiet in a much more deliberate, enforced way, and that enforced quiet had its own set of rules, its own patrols, and its own very good reasons behind it. We touched, back in the first chapter, on the fire safety origins of the curfew bell. But as towns grew larger, wealthier, and more crowded across the high and late medieval periods, the hours after dark accumulated a second, separate layer of anxiety that had nothing to do with flames and everything to do with what people might get up to once the streets went dark and most of the town was asleep. Consider what a medieval town at night actually looked like, or rather, didn't look like. No streetlights. No reliable public lighting of any kind beyond the occasional lantern outside a wealthy household's door, or the torch carried by someone brave or foolish enough to be out walking. Narrow streets that were disorienting enough by daylight became treacherous after dark, easy to get lost in, easy to stumble in, easy for someone with bad intentions to lurk in without being seen until it was too late. Add in the fact that many towns had grown rapidly, pulling in newcomers from the surrounding countryside looking for work, strangers whose faces and reputations weren't yet known to their neighbors, and you get a genuine and well-founded anxiety among town officials about exactly what might happen once darkness made anonymity easy. The response, across town after town, was the establishment of formal night watch systems, men, often ordinary citizens fulfilling a rotating civic duty rather than professional soldiers, tasked with patrolling the streets after curfew, carrying a lantern and sometimes a weapon, watching for exactly the kinds of trouble town officials feared most: theft, assault, unlicensed gatherings, fires left in bank despite the curfew bell, and simply anyone out on the streets without a good enough reason to be there. This is where the rules got actually specific, and in some ways restrictive. In many towns, being out after curfew without a lantern, without a legitimate reason, or without being recognized by the watch could get you stopped, questioned, and in some cases detained until morning, when you could explain yourself to a more senior official in the light of day. Some towns required visitors and travelers to lodge with an approved local host who would, in effect, vouch for them and take some responsibility for their behavior during their stay. An early, informal system of accountability in a world with no easy way to verify who a stranger actually was or where they'd come from. Ale houses and taverns, important social and economic institutions in medieval town life, but also, unsurprisingly, frequent flashpoints for exactly the kind of drunken disorder officials worried about, were often subject to their own specific closing time rules, tied closely to the general curfew. An alehouse that stayed open, serving drinks, while past the ringing of the curfew bell wasn't just breaking an abstract rule. It was, in the eyes of town officials, actively undermining the entire point of the curfew system, keeping drunk, agitated groups of people off the streets during the exact hours when there was no light to see trouble coming and no easy way to summon help if it did. There's in real terms interesting economic logic tangled up in all of this too. Medieval towns, especially prosperous trading towns, depended enormously on their reputation. A merchant deciding where to do business, a trader deciding which town to route goods through, a traveler deciding where it was safe to lodge for the night. All of these decisions were shaped, in part, by a town's reputation for order and safety. A town known for unchecked theft, drunken violence, and chaotic streets after dark was a town that risked losing exactly the kind of trade and traffic its prosperity depended on. The night watch, the curfew, the closing time rules for alehouses, all of it wasn't only about protecting individual residents, though that mattered. It was also, in a very real sense, protecting the town's economic reputation and its ability to keep attracting the trade that kept it alive. It's worth noting, too, that this system, however well-intentioned, wasn't applied evenly or fairly. The burden of suspicion after dark fell disproportionately on exactly the people with the least power to push back against it: the poor, travelers without connections, or a recognizable local host. Anyone whose face wasn't already known and trusted by the watch. Being out after dark while poor, or while a stranger, could draw exactly the kind of scrutiny that a wealthier, better-connected resident would never have to think twice about. The rule, in other words, protected the town as a whole while placing its heaviest costs on the people least equipped to absorb them, a pattern that, uncomfortably, doesn't feel entirely unfamiliar even now. Still, taken as a whole system, the bell, the banked fires, the night watch, the closing taverns, the questioned strangers, medieval towns built something truly thoughtful out of a set of very real, very grounded fears. Fire, theft, violence in the dark, a stranger's unknown intentions. None of these fears were irrational, and the rules built to manage them, however imperfectly and however unevenly enforced, represent one of the clearest examples in this entire story of a community trying to engineer safety out of pure necessity, using nothing but a bell, a rotation of citizen volunteers, and the simple, enforced discipline of going quiet when the sun went down. The next time you walk through a modern city at night, past streetlights, past illuminated shop fronts, past the quiet hum of a world that never really goes fully dark anymore, it's worth remembering that for most of human history, night wasn't just the absence of light. It was a genuine, managed risk. And the silence that fell over a medieval town after the curfew bell rang wasn't emptiness. It was a defense. A baker in medieval England could be dragged through the streets tied to a hurdle, pelted with whatever the crowd had on hand, for the crime of selling a loaf of bread that weighed a few ounces less than it should have. That punishment sounds absurdly harsh for what looks, at first glance, like a small commercial shortcut. Skim a little off the top, sell a slightly smaller loaf, pocket the difference. The kind of thing a modern customer might not even notice, let alone report. But medieval authorities treated bread fraud as something close to a crime against the community itself, and once you understand what bread actually meant to a medieval household's survival, the severity starts to make a grim kind of sense. Bread wasn't a side dish in medieval Europe. For the overwhelming majority of the population, it was the meal. Historians estimate that for a typical peasant or urban laborer, bread and other grain products could supply well over half of a person's daily calories, sometimes far more. A family's entire week could hinge on how much flour they could afford, how much a loaf actually weighed once it came out of the baker's oven, and whether that loaf would really feed everyone until the next one could be bought. Bread wasn't a purchase you made for pleasure. It was the difference between eating enough and not eating enough, stretched across every single day of the year. Given how central bread was to survival, it's easier to understand why medieval governments, from local town councils up to the crown itself, took the regulation of bread with a seriousness that can look, from a modern vantage point, almost obsessive. In England, this regulation took a formal, written shape known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, a piece of legislation that set out, in remarkable detail, exactly how much a loaf of bread should weigh relative to the price of wheat at any given time, and exactly what penalties a baker faced for selling short. The mechanics of the assize were clever and worth walking through, because they reveal how seriously medieval administrators thought about the economics of food. Grain prices fluctuated constantly, season to season and year to year, depending on harvest yields, weather, and demand. A bad harvest could send the price of wheat soaring. A good one could bring it back down. Rather than fixing the price of a loaf of bread at a flat rate, which would have been disastrous, either bankrupting bakers during expensive years or handing them windfall profits during cheap ones, the assize instead fixed the price of the loaf and adjusted its required weight up or down according to the current price of grain. When wheat was expensive, a penny loaf got smaller. When wheat was cheap, that same penny bought a bigger loaf. The price stayed familiar and predictable for ordinary customers, while the weight did the adjusting behind the scenes, calculated according to published tables that local officials were expected to know and enforce. This meant that at any given time, there was a specific, legally defined, and publicly knowable correct weight for a loaf of bread sold at a given price, which also meant that any baker selling a loaf lighter than that standard wasn't making some ambiguous, arguable judgment call. They were breaking a clearly defined law in a way that could be checked, verified, and proven with a simple set of scales. And officials did check. Towns appointed inspectors, sometimes called ale conners or bread weighers depending on the place and the period, whose job was specifically to move through markets, weigh loaves against the current legal standard, and catch bakers who were cutting corners. Some towns required bakers to stamp or mark their loaves with a personal symbol, which meant a short-weighted loaf could be traced directly back to the baker who made it, rather than disappearing anonymously into the general chaos of a crowded market stall. This wasn't casual oversight. It was a deliberate system built to make cheating difficult to get away with and easy to punish once caught. The punishments themselves varied by place and period, but they could be severe by any standard, and this is where the hurdle comes in. In some jurisdictions, a baker caught repeatedly selling underweight bread could be tied to a wooden frame, the hurdle, and dragged through the streets of the town behind a horse, a public humiliation meant to be seen by as many people as possible. Other penalties included fines, the loss of a license to bake and sell bread at all, or time in the stocks or pillory, where a convicted baker would be physically restrained in a public square while passers-by jeered, threw refuse, or worse. These weren't quiet administrative slaps on the wrist. They were designed, quite deliberately, to be humiliating and memorable, both for the baker being punished and for every other baker in town who heard about it and thought twice before shaving a few ounces off their own loaves. Why so harsh for what looks like ordinary commercial cheating? Because bread fraud, multiplied across an entire town's supply of bakers, wasn't really a small crime at all. If every baker in a town quietly shaved a little weight off every loaf, the effect on the town's poorest residents, the people already living closest to the edge of hunger, spending the largest share of their income on bread simply to survive, could be actually severe. A shortfall that looked trivial to a wealthy household, barely noticeable against a larger food budget, could represent a real and dangerous reduction in calories for a family already struggling to stretch what little they had. Widespread bread fraud wasn't a victimless nuisance. It was a slow, distributed way of starving the most vulnerable people in a town, one shorted loaf at a time. There's also a public order angle that medieval authorities understood with real clarity, because they had lived through the consequences of getting it wrong. Bread shortages, bread price spikes, and bread fraud were, across medieval and early modern European history, reliable triggers for public unrest. Riots over bread prices and bread quality happened repeatedly across the period, in town after town, precisely because bread mattered so much to so many people that its price and availability functioned as a kind of barometer for how well or badly a government was managing the basic welfare of its population. A town where bakers were widely known to be cheating customers, and where officials did nothing about it, was a town sitting on genuine, combustible resentment. Harsh, visible punishment of bread fraud wasn't only about protecting individual customers. It was about protecting the town's social stability, heading off exactly the kind of grievance that could tip over into real unrest if it went unaddressed. It's also worth noting how this system reflected a broader medieval instinct, one that shows up again and again across these strange old laws, toward treating certain goods not simply as ordinary commodities subject to whatever the market would bear, but as something closer to a shared public trust. Bread wasn't just another product a baker happened to sell. It was, functionally, a piece of the town's basic infrastructure for keeping its population alive, and infrastructure of that kind attracted a level of regulation and enforcement that a modern reader might associate more with utilities or public services than with a private bakery's daily business. The assize of bread and ale eventually faded as economies modernized, as market mechanisms grew more sophisticated, and as governments developed other tools for managing food security. But the underlying logic, that a population's most basic staple food deserves protection from quiet, distributed exploitation, because the people most harmed by that exploitation are exactly the people with the least power to fight back against it, is one that, in various forms, still echoes through food safety and consumer protection law today. It's just no longer enforced with a hurdle and a jeering crowd. If you walked into certain medieval towns and asked a local where the tanners lived, they wouldn't point you toward the center of the city. They'd point you downwind, and usually downstream, toward the edge of town, sometimes well outside the walls entirely, to a district most residents avoided unless they had specific business there. Tanning, the process of turning raw animal hides into usable leather, was one of a small cluster of trades that medieval towns, again and again, in place after place, pushed to the margins. Butchers slaughtering livestock, dyers running fabric through chemical baths, and tanners curing hides all tended to cluster in the same unwanted corners of a town's geography. And once you understand what these trades actually involve, day to day, it becomes very clear why nobody wanted them as neighbors. Start with tanning, because it's the most visceral example. Turning a raw, freshly removed animal hide into workable leather was a long, disgusting process by any standard, medieval or modern. Hides first had to be cleaned of remaining flesh and fat. Hair had to be loosened and scraped off, often using a lime solution that itself produced a harsh, unpleasant smell. And then, in one of the more infamous details of the medieval tanning process, hides frequently went through a stage that involved soaking them in a solution containing animal dung, sometimes specifically dog dung, collected and sold by dedicated dung gatherers whose entire trade existed to supply tanneries with exactly this raw material. The enzymes in the dung helped soften the hide and prepare it for the tanning process proper, which itself often involved large open vats of tannin extracted from tree bark, where hides would soak for weeks or even months. Every stage of this process produced smell, and not a mild, easily ignored smell. Tanneries were notorious across medieval Europe for an odor so strong and so unpleasant that towns routinely legislated to keep them at a distance from residential neighborhoods, from markets, from anywhere respectable people gathered or lived. It wasn't simply a matter of taste or delicacy. A concentration of tanneries could make an entire section of a town unpleasant to live near, and the runoff from the tanning process, full of lime, tannin, and organic waste, posed a real threat to water quality if it drained into a stream or river that the rest of the town depended on for drinking water or washing. Butchers presented a related but distinct problem. Slaughtering animals for meat produced blood, offal, and waste in large quantities, day after day, and disposing of that waste safely and hygienically was a genuine challenge in a crowded medieval town without modern sanitation. Left unmanaged, slaughterhouse waste could attract vermin, contaminate water sources, and create exactly the kind of filth that medieval towns, again, without any formal understanding of germ theory, but with plenty of hard-won intuition about what conditions seemed to precede outbreaks of disease, had learned to associate with sickness. Many towns required butchers to operate in designated areas, often near a river or stream specifically so waste could be flushed away from the town center, and increasingly pushed slaughtering operations toward the edges of town as populations grew and the sheer volume of waste from feeding a larger city became harder to manage close to where people actually lived. Dyers, as we touched on back in the chapter about sumptuary laws and forbidden colors, dealt with their own set of hazards, toxic mordants, large quantities of contaminated wastewater, and fumes from certain dyeing processes that could be in real terms unpleasant and occasionally dangerous to breathe in concentrated, poorly ventilated conditions. Like tanners and butchers, dyers frequently found themselves pushed toward the periphery of town or clustered along a particular stretch of river specifically zoned, in an informal but very real sense, for exactly this kind of industrial-scale, waste-heavy work. What's striking about this pattern, once you step back and look at it across multiple trades and multiple towns, is how clearly it represents an early, intuitive form of something we'd now recognize instantly as land use zoning. Medieval towns didn't have a formal planning department, didn't have zoning maps, didn't have the vocabulary of industrial districts versus residential districts that a modern city planner would use. But they arrived, through repeated practical experience and repeated complaint, at almost exactly the same conclusion that modern zoning law encodes explicitly. Certain trades produce enough smell, waste, and potential health hazard that they truly cannot coexist comfortably with dense residential living, and the fairest, most workable solution is to physically separate the two. This separation wasn't always comfortable or fair for the people doing the work. Tanners, butchers, and dyers were skilled tradespeople performing really essential economic functions. Leather and dyed cloth were valuable, widely traded goods, and meat was, obviously, a critical part of the medieval food supply. But the social status attached to these trades tended to be lower than trades that didn't involve constant, visible, smellable contact with blood, waste, and chemical byproducts. Living and working in the smelly, unfashionable districts pushed to the edge of town became, over time, part of the broader social identity of these trades, a physical, geographic marker of a lower rung on the town's social ladder, reinforcing exactly the kind of hierarchy that sumptuary laws were also busy enforcing through clothing. There's also a fascinating long-term legacy to this pattern that shows up in the historical geography of European cities even today. Neighborhoods that grew up around medieval tanning, dyeing, and butchering districts often kept distinctive names, street patterns, or reputations for centuries after the original trades that shaped them had moved on or modernized. A street named for tanners in a city where no tannery has operated in centuries. A district still associated in local memory with the smell and grime of trades that vanished generations ago. The physical zoning decisions made by medieval town officials, driven by nothing more sophisticated than the practical need to keep the worst smells and the most contaminated water away from where people actually lived, left a footprint on urban geography that outlasted the trades themselves by hundreds of years. It's worth sitting, too, with what this reveals about medieval urban life more broadly. A town wasn't simply a collection of buildings and streets. It was a functioning system that had to somehow accommodate everything a community actually needed: food, clothing, leather goods, waste disposal, while also protecting, as best it could, the health and comfort of its residents. Pushing the tanners, butchers, and dyers to the margins wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a working town's best available answer to a difficult problem. How do you keep doing the smelly, essential, unavoidable work a community depends on, without making that same community sick or simply impossible to live in? After a medieval harvest, once the main crop had been cut and gathered, there was still grain left scattered across the field, stalks the reapers had missed, ears that had fallen loose during the cutting and binding. Picking up that leftover grain was called gleaning, and it sounds, on the surface, like the most harmless activity imaginable. Walking through an already harvested field, gathering up scraps nobody else wanted. But gleaning was regulated with surprising care across medieval Europe, restricted by custom, and sometimes by explicit local law regarding who could glean, when they could start, and how much they were allowed to take. And the reasons behind those restrictions reveal something actually important about how fragile medieval food security actually was, and how deliberately villages tried to protect their most vulnerable members from both starvation and each other. To understand why gleaning needed rules at all, you have to understand what it actually meant for the poorest households in a medieval village. For a family with little or no land of their own, widows, the elderly, the very poor, laborers who worked other people's fields for wages rather than farming their own, the grain left behind after a harvest could represent a significant supplement to what little food they had, sometimes the difference between getting through the winter and not. Custom across much of medieval Europe generally recognized some form of right to glean, often specifically protecting access for the poorest members of a community, reflecting a broadly shared understanding that a harvested field's leftovers belonged, in some meaningful sense, to the community's neediest rather than simply to whoever got there first or grabbed the most. But recognizing a right to glean and managing that right fairly turned out to be two very different things. And this is where the regulations start to get specific. If gleaning were left completely unregulated, anyone allowed into a field at any time, taking as much as they wanted, a few predictable problems emerged quickly, problems that villages across the medieval period learned to anticipate and address through custom and, in some places, formal rule. First, there was the timing problem. If people were allowed to glean before the main harvest was fully complete, gleaners moving through a field could trample standing crop that hadn't been cut yet, damage grain that was still meant to be professionally harvested and threshed, or simply create chaos and conflict between the official harvest workers and the gleaners trying to get an early start on the leftovers. Many communities address this by establishing a formal signal, sometimes literally a bell, echoing the same logic as the curfew bell we started this whole story with, marking the moment when the main harvest was officially finished and gleaning could begin. Starting to glean before that signal was often treated as a real violation, not a minor faux pas, precisely because of the damage early gleaning could do to a harvest that hadn't been safely gathered yet. Second, there was the question of who actually got to glean at all. If gleaning were treated as a free-for-all open to literally anyone, wealthier households with more labor available, more children, more able-bodied adults free from other work, could simply outcompete the poorest, most vulnerable gleaners, descending on a field in force and stripping it of leftover grain before a struggling widow or an elderly laborer, working alone and slowly, could gather more than a fraction of what she needed. Some communities responded to this by explicitly restricting gleaning rights to specific categories of people, often the poor, the elderly, widows, and children specifically, attempting to preserve the leftover grain of the harvest as a targeted safety net for exactly the people who needed it most, rather than letting it become just another resource wealthier households could scoop up on top of everything else they already had. Third, there was the landowner's own interest to consider, which didn't disappear just because the main crop had already been harvested. A field, even after harvest, still had value and still belonged to someone. Some restrictions on gleaning existed specifically to protect a landowner's remaining interest in the field, preventing gleaners from damaging fences, hedges, or boundary markers, restricting access to certain areas, or setting rules about how gleaning activity could proceed without interfering with other uses the landowner might have for the field once the main harvest was in. What emerges from all of this, when you put the pieces together, is a picture of gleaning not as some vague, informal custom left entirely to goodwill, but as a regulated system, one that villages across medieval Europe built, refined, and enforced through a mix of local custom, communal expectation, and in some places explicit rule, precisely because the stakes were high enough for exactly the people with the least power in the community, that leaving it unregulated risked real harm. A field's leftover grain, in an economy running as close to subsistence as much of medieval rural Europe did, wasn't a trivial resource. It was, for the households who depended on it most, a genuine buffer against hunger, and villages treated the fair, orderly distribution of that buffer as something worth actively protecting, not simply hoping would sort itself out. This is one of relatively few areas of medieval rural law explicitly designed to favor the poorest, least powerful members of a community over the interests of those with more land, more labor, and more leverage. Most of the legal structure of manorial life, as we saw back in the chapter on marriage permissions, tended to reinforce existing hierarchies of power and property. Gleaning restrictions, by contrast, often worked in something closer to the opposite direction, carving out a specific, protected space where the community's neediest members had a recognized claim that even a landowner's own laborers or wealthier neighbors weren't simply free to override. It's a small, easily overlooked example, tucked into the unglamorous logistics of a medieval harvest. But it points to something in real terms significant, that even in a deeply hierarchical, often unequal society, medieval communities were capable of building deliberate, functioning systems specifically intended to protect their most vulnerable members from being starved out entirely, not through charity alone, but through actual, enforced rules about who got to walk through a field, and when, and how much they were allowed to carry away. Long before anyone in medieval Europe understood what a germ was, before anyone could have explained why dirty water made people sick, Medieval towns had already begun figuring out, through hard experience and repeated tragedy, that where you dug a well and where you dumped your waste were connected in ways that truly mattered. This shows up across medieval municipal records in a form that looks, at first glance, almost bureaucratically dry. Rules about where wells could be dug, minimum distances required between a well and a cesspit or latrine, restrictions on dumping waste into certain waterways, and requirements that certain trades, the tanners and dyers we met in an earlier chapter among them, locate their operations downstream from the parts of town that drew drinking water from the same river. None of it reads, on the surface, like dramatic history. But underneath the dry language of these ordinances sits a really impressive body of practical, empirically earned knowledge about disease prevention, arrived at centuries before anyone had the scientific vocabulary to explain why it worked. Consider the basic problem medieval towns faced. Clean water was essential, obviously, for drinking, cooking, and washing. But a dense medieval town also produced enormous quantities of human and animal waste, day after day, year after year, and disposing of that waste safely, in a world without sewers in anything like the modern sense, was a constant, unglamorous challenge. Cesspits, latrines, and general refuse disposal all had the potential, if placed carelessly, to contaminate the very water sources a town depended on to survive, seeping through soil, into a well, draining into a stream that fed a town's drinking supply, or simply accumulating close enough to a water source that runoff during heavy rain carried waste directly into it. Towns didn't need germ theory to notice the pattern that emerged from this kind of carelessness. They needed only the far cruder, far more painful evidence of repeated illness clustering around certain neighborhoods, certain wells, certain streets, and, over time, the accumulated folk knowledge of which practices seemed to precede outbreaks of sickness and which didn't. Wells positioned too close to a latrine or a cesspit developed a reputation, sometimes formalized into an actual regulation, sometimes simply passed down as local common sense. Don't drink from that well. Don't dig a new one there. Keep waste and water sources a safe distance apart. Some towns codified this knowledge into remarkably specific rules. Minimum distances between a privy and a well appear in municipal records across various medieval European towns, sometimes quite precisely specified, sometimes phrased more generally as a requirement that waste disposal be kept a reasonable distance from sources of drinking water, with local officials empowered to judge what counted as reasonable and to order changes when they judged a situation dangerous. Certain trades, again, tanners and dyers especially, given the volume of contaminated wastewater their work produced, were frequently required to operate downstream of the parts of a town that drew water for drinking and cooking, a rule that shows an intuitive, functional grasp of how water flows through a landscape and carries whatever's dumped into it further along, downstream, toward whoever draws water next. This kind of regulation became especially urgent and especially visible in surviving records during and after major disease outbreaks. Plague, in particular, devastated medieval Europe repeatedly across the period, most catastrophically in the mid-14th century, and while medieval authorities had no understanding of the actual mechanism of plague transmission, they didn't know about the bacteria involved, didn't know about the role of fleas and the rodents that carried them. They nonetheless developed a strong, repeatedly reinforced association between filth, contaminated water, crowded unsanitary conditions, and outbreaks of serious illness. That association, however incomplete or scientifically confused by modern standards, drove real policy. Towns that had survived one epidemic often responded by tightening exactly this kind of sanitation regulation, clearer rules about waste disposal, closer attention to water sources, stricter enforcement of distance requirements between wells and cesspits, in the hope, not always well-founded in its specific reasoning, but often effective in its practical result, of reducing the risk of the next outbreak. It's worth pausing on just how remarkable this actually is, stripped of modern hindsight. Medieval town officials had no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no concept of pathogens traveling through contaminated water. What they had was centuries of accumulated, hard-won observation. This well made people sick, that well didn't. This neighborhood, packed close to overflowing cesspits, suffered worse outbreaks than that one. better separated from its waste. Out of that observation, without ever fully understanding the mechanism behind it, they built functioning public health regulations, rules about distance, rules about placement, rules about which trades belonged where relative to the town's water supply, that did actually reduce, even if imperfectly and unevenly, the risk of exactly the kind of contamination that modern science would later explain in precise, microbial detail. None of this means medieval sanitation was good by any modern standard. It very much wasn't, and outbreaks of waterborne illness remained a serious, recurring problem throughout the period regardless of whatever regulations existed on paper. Enforcement was inconsistent. Understanding was incomplete. Plenty of towns got the specifics wrong, even while getting the broad instinct right. And plenty of wells were dug in places that later proved dangerous despite following whatever rules were in place at the time. But the underlying achievement here is still worth recognizing. A body of empirical, trial-and-error public health knowledge, built up over generations without the scientific tools that would later explain why any of it actually worked, encoded into ordinary municipal law about wells and cesspits and downstream trades. It's one of the clearest examples in this entire story of medieval communities reasoning their way, however imperfectly, toward protective rules, not because they understood the biology, but because they paid close enough attention to their own hard experience to notice the pattern and cared enough about the people who might get sick next to actually do something about it. In 14th century England, King Edward III issued a proclamation banning a sport that was, by that point, hugely popular among ordinary people across the country, and the reason had almost nothing to do with the game itself, and everything to do with what people were supposed to be doing instead. The sport was an early, chaotic ancestor of football, not the modern, codified game with its careful rules and defined pitch, but a much rougher, often violent free-for-all that could involve entire villages, sometimes hundreds of participants, wrestling and shoving a ball across open fields, through streets, occasionally through rivers, towards some agreed, but very loosely defined goal. It was disorganized, occasionally destructive, and enormously popular precisely because it required almost nothing to play beyond a ball, an open space, and a willingness to get thoroughly battered by your neighbors. Edward's proclamation, issued in 1363, didn't ban football alone. It grouped it together with a handful of other popular pastimes, including various dice and ball games, and explicitly ordered that these activities be set aside in favor of something the crown considered far more urgent for ordinary Englishmen to spend their limited free time practicing: archery. To understand why a king would care enough about how commoners spent their Sunday afternoons to legislate against a popular game, you have to understand what English military power actually depended on during this period, and just how much of that power rested on something that looked, on the surface, almost absurdly simple: a very large number of ordinary men who could reliably shoot a longbow. The English longbow, by the 14th century, had become one of the most consequential weapons in European warfare, not because any single shot from a longbow was more devastating than a crossbow bolt or the strike of a knight's lance, but because of what a coordinated mass of longbowmen could do together on a battlefield. A skilled longbowman could fire arrows at a rate that a crossbowman simply couldn't match, sending volley after volley into an advancing enemy formation with a speed and density that could break a charge before it ever closed the distance. England's military strategy, particularly during the long, grinding conflict with France that would come to be remembered as the 100 Years' War, leaned heavily on exactly this advantage: massed longbowmen, drawn overwhelmingly from the ordinary population rather than the nobility, capable of devastating an enemy force from a distance before hand-to-hand combat ever became necessary. But here's the catch, and it's the entire reason this chapter exists. Shooting a longbow well was not an easy skill to pick up quickly, and it was especially not a skill you could expect an army of hastily assembled commoners to suddenly possess the moment a war broke out. Drawing a proper English war bow required serious physical strength. Bows of this period could require draw weights that would leave a modern, untrained shooter unable to even fully draw the string, let alone shoot accurately, and that kind of strength, along with the accuracy and consistency needed to actually hit a target at range, came only from years of regular, sustained practice, ideally starting from a young age and continuing for a lifetime. This is precisely why archery couldn't simply be a skill reserved for professional soldiers. trained only when a specific campaign demanded it. England's military strength depended on having a broad base of the ordinary male population already capable of drawing a heavy war bow with real skill, ready to be called up when needed rather than trained from nothing in the middle of a crisis. That meant archery practice needed to be a routine, widespread, more or less permanent feature of ordinary English life, something men did regularly, for years, not something crammed in hastily before a campaign. And this is exactly where football, and the other banned games alongside it, became a genuine problem in the eyes of the crown. Every hour a young man spent chasing a ball through a muddy field on his day off was an hour he wasn't spending at the archery butts, developing exactly the strength, technique, and consistency that England's military doctrine depended on having available in large numbers across the population. Edward's proclamation wasn't really about disapproving of football as entertainment or worrying about the injuries it caused, though the rough, occasionally violent nature of medieval football certainly didn't help its case. It was about protecting a strategically vital pool of national military capability from being eroded by a fun but militarily useless alternative that was, by all accounts, wildly popular and constantly competing for exactly the same free-time archery practice needed. Edward wasn't alone in this concern, either, and this wasn't a one-off proclamation quickly forgotten. Similar bans and encouragements toward archery practice, sometimes specifically naming football and other games as distractions to be avoided, appear repeatedly across English royal and local legislation over the following decades and even centuries, reissued again and again, a pattern that itself tells you something important. A law that worked perfectly the first time wouldn't need to be reissued repeatedly. The fact that English monarchs kept coming back to this same concern, generation after generation, strongly suggests that football, and the simple, universal appeal of kicking a ball around with your friends, kept winning out over the more disciplined, more physically demanding, less immediately fun practice of archery, no matter how many royal proclamations insisted otherwise. Some towns went further than simple prohibition, actively mandating archery practice on specific days, requiring able-bodied men within a certain age range to attend and practice at designated times, sometimes under penalty of fine for failing to show up. This wasn't a suggestion. It was treated, in a very real sense, as a component of national defense, ordinary civilian life reorganized, at least in part, around the ongoing maintenance of a military capability the kingdom couldn't afford to let atrophy. It's a in real terms strange thing to reckon with, that England's military success against France during some of the most famous battles of the medieval period, battles that live on in popular memory as triumphs of skilled longbowmen cutting down heavily armored knights, rested, in part, on a long, unglamorous, repeatedly reissued legal campaign against ordinary people's love of kicking a ball around on their day off. The battlefield glory came later. The Real Foundation was built on muddy village greens on Sunday afternoons, in the tedious, mandated repetition of drawing a heavy bow again and again, year after year, because a king had decided, with real strategic clarity, that his kingdom's survival depended on it more than anyone's right to a game of football. When plague swept through a medieval town, killing dozens or hundreds of people within a matter of weeks, the town faced a problem that went beyond grief and beyond the practical challenge of digging enough graves fast enough. It faced the question of how, exactly, to bury that many bodies without making the crisis even worse. Medieval authorities, again working without any real understanding of germ theory or the specific biological mechanisms of disease transmission, nonetheless developed a genuine, if imperfect, body of practical rules around burial, depth requirements, timing restrictions, location rules, and in periods of severe crisis, entirely separate burial grounds set apart specifically for plague victims, built from the same kind of hard, repeated, empirical observation that shaped the water and sanitation. Rules we looked at earlier in this story. Start with depth, because it's one of the more concretely documented aspects of medieval burial regulation. Across various times and places in medieval and early modern Europe, church and civic authorities set minimum depth requirements for graves, often specifying several feet of earth covering a body, sometimes more during periods of epidemic disease. The reasoning behind this wasn't purely about respect for the dead, though that mattered enormously in a deeply religious society that took the proper treatment of a body extremely seriously. It was also, quite explicitly in some surviving records, about preventing exactly the kind of shallow, hastily dug graves that could leave decomposing remains too close to the surface, vulnerable to being disturbed by scavenging animals, more likely to contaminate nearby soil and water, and, in the minds of people who had learned to associate filth and decay with disease even without understanding the precise mechanism, more likely to spread whatever sickness had killed the person in the first place. This concern intensified dramatically during major epidemics, and the mid-14th century plague outbreak that devastated Europe provides some of the clearest surviving evidence of how seriously authorities took burial regulation once mortality reached truly catastrophic levels. When death tolls climbed high enough that individual burial in a town's normal churchyard became physically impossible to keep up with. Too many bodies, not enough time, not enough hands to dig enough individual graves fast enough. Towns and church authorities turned to mass burial pits. But even these emergency measures came with rules. Pits needed to be dug to a sufficient depth. Bodies needed to be covered promptly with earth or lime rather than left exposed. Some records describe deliberate use of lime in mass graves, a practice that, whatever its precise scientific justification and medieval understanding, reflected a genuine, functional instinct that certain treatments could help manage the risks associated with a large number of decomposing bodies in close proximity to a living population. Timing mattered too, and this is where medieval burial regulation starts to look almost eerily aligned with practices that later, truly scientific public health authorities would independently arrive at for very similar reasons. Authorities in various plague-stricken towns pushed for burial to happen quickly after death, without the extended periods of viewing, wake, and ceremony that might have been customary in ordinary times. This wasn't disrespect for the dead or a callous rush to be finished with mourning. It reflected a genuine, hard-learned anxiety that a body left unburied too long, especially during an epidemic, posed some kind of ongoing risk to the living around it, a risk medieval authorities couldn't explain in scientific terms, but had clearly learned, through repeated bitter experience, to take seriously regardless. Location rules added another layer. In periods of severe epidemic, some towns established burial grounds specifically set apart for plague victims, physically separated from a town's normal churchyard, and, where possible, positioned away from residential areas and water sources, echoing precisely the same downstream, kept at a distance logic we saw applied to tanneries and dye works. The underlying instinct was consistent across all of these different rules, whether about wells, workshops, or graves. Keep sources of contamination and disease at a physical remove from where people actually lived and drew their water, because experience had taught, again and again, that proximity mattered, even without anyone being able to fully explain why. There's something really moving, when you sit with it, about how these rules represent medieval communities trying to hold two difficult truths at once during their worst moments of crisis. The need to treat the dead with dignity and proper ceremony, honoring beliefs about the soul and the afterlife that mattered enormously to the people carrying out these burials, and the simultaneous, urgent need to protect the living from whatever danger a mounting death toll might represent. These weren't always easy priorities to balance, and surviving accounts from plague years make clear that the scale of death during the worst outbreaks sometimes overwhelmed even the most careful regulations, forcing hasty, undignified mass burials that fell well short of what anyone would have wanted under ordinary circumstances. But the rules existed, were taken seriously, and were refined and reissued repeatedly across successive waves of epidemic disease precisely because towns kept learning, through repeated hard experience, that how you buried your dead during a crisis mattered to whether that crisis got worse or eventually eased. It's worth ending this story here, with the graves, because it brings us back to where we started, a bell warning a town to smother its fires, a set of rules built entirely out of hard experience, repeated tragedy, and the accumulated, unglamorous wisdom of people who didn't have the scientific tools to explain why something worked, but paid close enough attention to notice that it did. That, in the end, might be the real thread running through every single rule in this story. The curfew bell, the forbidden colors, the banished pigs, the leaning houses, The marriages requiring permission, the night watch, the weighed loaves, the trades pushed to the margins, the regulated grain, the carefully placed wells, the banned football matches, the graves dug to a careful depth. None of these rules came from abstract theory. They came from communities that had been burned, poisoned, trampled, starved, and buried by the consequences of not having the rule yet, and who built, piece by piece, generation by generation, a body of practical wisdom that kept the next disaster just slightly further away. If any of these rules struck you as stranger or smarter than you expected going in, that's really the whole point of digging back through history like this. The past wasn't primitive. It was paying attention in exactly the ways it could to problems every bit as real as the ones we're still solving today. If you want more of the past told slowly, like this, subscribe and stay a while longer next time.